And actually, that makes total sense. Yeah. Because I know me.
So that's our life mission. That's the McShinn's mission.
You don't have to understand my boundaries to respect them.
Well, no, I'm the president and co-founder of McShinn, a person in long-term recovery from substance use disorders.
How do you go about fixing the damage in the trust between the family after you get out?
Okay, I gotta work on that.
Celebrating my 6 months, didn't have cake.
Yeah.
Gosh, showed up.
Hello, and thank you for joining us on today's live version of Get in the Herd, the McShinn podcast, the McShinn Recovery Podcast, brought to you from sunny Richmond, Virginia. My name is Raymond Ruybe. I'm your host. I'm Director of Data and Quality Control here at the McShinn Foundation, as well as being a registered peer recovery specialist. I'm very excited because today we're joined by a very special guest. She is an author. Her name is Gigi Langer. She is a PhD from Stanford University in psychology education. Her master's is in psychology from Stanford, and her bachelor's was in Spanish and education, also from Stanford. She's won the Graduate Faculty Teaching Award from Eastern Michigan University, as well as a writing award from the American Association of Colleges, as well as a whole tapestry of other awards. I want to thank you for joining us, Gigi.
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
I'm glad to have you on the show. Thank you. And we're going to be talking about your new book, Love More Now, which was just released. You want to tell us a little bit about what the inspiration for that was? I know you've got your first book, which was 50 Ways to Worry Less Now, which you published back in 2019. Is this sort of like a counterpart to that novel?
Yeah, somebody called it the Now series because it's worry less now, love more now. But the word now is pretty carefully chosen because that idea of staying in the now rather than living in the wreckage of our future or regretting the past, which I think a lot of people facing addiction struggle with, including me. So once I got sober, and clean, I still had this voice in my head. Some call it the committee. Oh, so helpful, right? And it's whispering these lies to me. You're not good enough to do this. Nobody likes you because you did this in the past. You've been divorced 3 times. What the hell is wrong with you? Blah, 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 blah. And it's very self-defeating. And so I realized that, of course, recovering people are very prone to this because a lot of us are highly sensitive or grew up with difficulties in our youth and received a lot of negative messages. So they're kind of logged in there. But everyday people, too, struggle with our negative thinking. And so I've written my books that the biggest audience for both of them is people in recovery, because, of course, my path is involving recovery. But they're not religious. There's some spiritual stuff, but very open. You can find that power anywhere.
Yeah, I really appreciated that in Love More Now, when I saw that you had a greater emphasis on the higher power sort of as a loving energy, as more of like internal wisdom rather than a capital G God. And, as an atheist, I really resonated with that because that's the serenity, that's the peace that I tend to look for on a daily basis. When I'm trying to live more now, it's more along the lines of, I'm not going to force myself to believe in something I don't, but there are some things that I can viscerally feel are universally true. And I really appreciated that you called that out in your novel.
Yes, thank you. And, it's, I don't believe any of us can figure out through lots of mental analysis ways to get better. I think there's a part to that. In therapy, we look at, I learned this whispered lie that I'm not lovable. Okay, now what? It's not an excuse. It's how do we go forward from it? So that's precisely what both books are about. The first one has lots of tools that I learned. And, the reason I wrote that was I was on an airplane one day and my mother and I had this wonderful interaction. And I used to just feel really uncomfortable around my mother. And the healing was just so profound. I thought, I wish other people could gain some of these tools that I had gained, not just in recovery, but in therapy, I had discovered energy work, just this whole variety of tools that can help us be more balanced in our thinking and our emotions, and not let those things carry us away into this land of the future and the past.
Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit for our audience about your recovery journey, your personal recovery journey? I mean, you're a very well educated, well published author, writer, psychologist. Like, how did you get from there to here? Like, what was that journey like for you?
Well, I didn't get sober until I had convinced myself that I was not able to take good care of myself if I had one drug or drink. And that happened after graduate school. So the way I got through graduate school was, all those smart people in Stanford, what the hell am I doing here with that old whispered lie? You're not smart enough. You're not good enough. So I had my bar that I went to every night, and I had my marijuana that I smoked every night for the stress. And this was in the late 70s, early 80s. So that stress, and realizing that my life was getting more very seedy, running off with strangers. And the big kicker was that before starting graduate school, I had already been married twice. And one of them was, a 3 to 4 year. It turned out that he had other sexual preferences, so it was best to end that. The second one was like on paper, so we could travel together. So we ended that. But the point was, I felt that dream of the picket fence and the 2 children and the stable marriage that I'd been sold, all through those years of songs about love and so on, it was crashing and burning. I could not get a successful relationship to work. And then at the end of grad school, still using, I met a guy who became my third husband, and that's how I got to Michigan. And, he didn't have any of the characteristics of the other ones. And I thought, oh, this guy's really got it together. And to my amazement, within, 9 months of marrying him, he would be traveling, and I would go out and go to a bar and find a man who had marijuana and go home and sleep with them, strangers, so here I am holding this brand new PhD from Stanford in one hand, and I got this other behavior going on, and the dissonance, it just was driving me crazy. Plus, I knew I was endangering myself driving that way. So I did go to a psychologist, and I said, what's wrong with this picture? And that was about in 84, and I was still in the marriage. It took me 6 months with him when he suggested, he got the family history, of course, came from an alcoholic home like so many of us do. And he said, well, you're in the early stages of alcoholism. And he said, try doing this, having 2 drinks, no more, no less, every day.
Yeah.
And, I watched myself do that. And there were times when I could stop at 2. That's why I had trouble convincing myself I was an alcoholic. Excuse me. But then there were other times that I would have 1 or 2 and then go off and get more and more and find the drugs and the man and whatever. And after 6 months, thank God I lived through it, but I had to admit to myself, if I put any substance that's mind altering in my body, I am going to endanger myself and others. And that's when I ended up going to my first meeting. Now in 86, the only game in town was Alcoholics Anonymous. So that's where I went.
That's great. And you've been in it ever since 1986.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
That's awesome.
And I really do and have worked a program, because in addition to the awful behavior when I was drinking and using, the mental pain of carrying out this image professionally and then having this private little shameful life, and just was excruciating. And I think that's been a motivator for me. I just don't want to feel that again.
Yeah. Yeah, you know what I heard you say there is that the white picket fences and the ideal marriage, it all sounds like a standard of perfection. I think that a lot of us try to hold ourselves to. Now, you talk about this in your book, how holding ourselves to that kind of perfection can just be so detrimental to the self and to our own identity, because then, we're always feeling like a failure. Do you want to go a little bit more into detail about that?
Sure. In the first book and some in the second book, I talked about how, especially those of us who grow up in environments where we don't feel loved and nurtured for whatever reason, and also many of us who are highly sensitive, where we're a little more bothered by things, we're a little more introverted, we're more likely to kind of lose our base. And so I sort of came out of the womb thinking I was less than. Okay, I had older brothers and sisters who were very extroverted. I just felt like an alien. And I think you hear this from a lot of people who struggle with addiction and alcoholism. And so what does a person do who feels basically bad about ourselves? Well, we look at other people who look like they're being loved by others and being admired, and we imitate them. So I started building this house of cards of my own self-esteem. I tried to be funny. The biggest place I got my fake ID esteem was from getting good grades, because nobody in my family had done that. So of course I have all these degrees. Now, I wouldn't say that was only motivated by a negative force, but there was a certain attachment to security that came along with that perfectionism. I must perform or I won't be loved. One of the basic whispered lies that a lot of us live with.
That's right.
And so that it's very destructive. And as long as we're using substances to numb ourselves out so that I don't have to look at that belief squarely. And I don't think many people, I'm not saying if you're in early recovery or thinking about getting into recovery that you have to dig into all this stuff about why you feel less adequate and so on. I think the first step is just saying, oh, I don't know how to love myself. I don't love myself. How do I stop drinking so I can find the real self in there? That is I believe, a being of love, like you said, in the center. I was so afraid that if I got sober and stopped numbing myself, that when I got down inside myself, I would find this pit of awful feelings that I was afraid were in there, and they would come gushing out and overwhelm me. And that's why I thought I needed to keep myself numb, because I couldn't look at that. So in recovery, we have to stop lying to ourselves and start looking at ourselves. But ultimately, we find the treasure inside, which is, all that stuff in there that was just covering up all the goodness in me that's really there, that's lovable.
Yeah, I heard, when you're talking, I kept on thinking about the fourth step. Like I talk to people all the time, and we get hung up on the fourth step, and they're just like, made a searching and fearless inventory. And I was like, think of it the first time as sort of like using a broom. And the second time is when you go in and you mop. You don't have to get to all of the ooey gooey chewy center of like character defects right away. It's just more or less like, hey, it's working on the self. And, I think that a lot of people in new recovery, especially, they fall into this trap of, they think that self-actualization starts when they put the drug or when they put the drink down, but it happens so much later. Like that spiritual awakening isn't something that happens right away. It's something that happens in time. And benefit for the new person in recovery is, hey, give yourself some time to work it out. You don't have to get it all done today. Now, to use your language, like it doesn't all happen right now. Would you agree with that?
Oh yeah. In the Worry Less Now book, I painted very clearly those different layers of healing that came as I did what we call the house cleaning steps, the
Mm-hmm.
inventory, sharing it, looking at the character flaws, and then asking that they be removed. And of course, the amends. But I think, the first thing I saw was just, ooh, look at this nasty voice that's going on in my head telling me, in my fourth step. And that was really useful. And I started, with the therapist, with my sponsor. And I think the main thing to remember is our own thinking all alone is what got us in trouble. So we need a coach, we need a therapist, we need a sponsor, however we get that support where we're not just me, myself, and I trying to figure it out, that we get other perspectives coming in. And then when it's easier to look at ourselves when we have someone right next to us, loving us, and they've been there before and they've done stuff worse. So it's really helpful to know, for me, and I say this quite often, that gushing out that we were afraid would happen, it comes in very manageable layers. Mm-hmm. And that's because we're not trying to do it ourselves. We've harnessed ourselves to some source of thinking, sanity, direction that's bigger than our own self-sabotaging fear, whether that's our sponsor, however we find it. And then I find that force for good, our true self, however, regulates the speed and timing of which layers come up. So it wasn't until 5 years sober that I realized there had been sexual touching in my youth. No wonder I was hypervigilant and afraid and anxious all the time.
Yeah. You spoke about it in terms of calling it that sort of nasty internal voice. I think of it in terms of, the scripts that we rehearse and the things that we tell ourselves in order to sense make what might be going on that's negative in our lives. And some of the more nasty things that I find myself prone to are very similar to yours. I'm not good enough, and so I need to work harder. And then by working harder, is working becoming an addiction in and of itself? Is perfectionism becoming this addictive personality? And then, how am I sort of deconstructing the scripts that I've been telling myself, for me over the course of 51 years, to sort of get to the center of what it is that I'm trying to be. So I really love the way that you frame that. Now, do you have experience with trauma counseling in your own recovery journey? Is that something that you've gone through?
Yes. At that 5-year period when I discovered something had happened, I sought a new therapist who was experienced with sexual trauma recovery. We didn't call it that in those days.
Yeah.
But and then she had a group that she ran for sexual healing, people who felt really problematic with sexual stuff and touching. And, that was a 3 or 4 year process. And it was not easy at all. And I healed. I think one key phrase, two things. Number one, I didn't have to figure out what exactly had happened when and how. That wasn't the key to healing, because that's like picking at the scab.
Yeah. It wasn't a testimony. Yeah.
Yes. It was going to the feelings that the experience left me with, of never being safe, of always having to compensate, and those feelings then could be healed. So I love this saying, I'm not responsible. No, I'm not to blame for what happened to me in the past. I am responsible for healing it in my adulthood. It's not an excuse to keep doing the same old stuff. It can heal. And that's part of why I wrote the 50 Ways to Worry Less Now, because in addition to the 12-step kinds of tools, there are energetic tools. Energy healing is extremely helpful, especially with that early trauma stuff. And now you see with the EMDR, the eye movement kind of therapy, and a lot of other ones I put in here, the tapping. And I don't just mention them, but I try to give a little of the one paragraph of the research of why it's
Sure.
good, and then I try to teach you how to do it, because I'm a former teacher, right? So I have, here's how you do this, or here's where you go to learn how. So those energetic tools for healing are really important. And then the cognitive, what I call cognitive restructuring, where we take those scripts that are burned into our neurological, framework, and those can be reprogrammed.
Sure.
And for example, I got myself, once I realized how much I was hating myself with my self-speech, I got a little audio tape that was a self-hypnosis. People like me, I love myself. It sounded trite, but it reprogrammed. I did it a lot. Yeah.
One of the things that came up in my early 20s for me, that was trauma related, that I had no idea was even a trauma, came from the fact that I am an individual who suffers from epilepsy. And there's a certain level of disconnection from the self and a certain lack of control over my own body and my own mind that I experience. If I have a seizure, I'm not at the wheel. Something else is driving me for a little while. I won't even remember what that experience was like. And I didn't even realize that I was suffering from trauma from my own medical condition because of it. And it took years, decade of reprogramming of the way that I thought about myself and, my certain control fallacies that I have about always having to be perfect, always having to be at the wheel. And I just, once I was done with it, it was just like, I feel so free. And now I could just sort of like live life on my own terms and not on this idealized version of what other people think perfection is. Like, I'm fine just the way I am. So that was really eye-opening for me. And I went through some EMDR therapy for that also. I'm a huge fan of cognitive behavioral therapy. I don't know if you're familiar with SMART recovery.
Yeah.
I'm also a big fan of the SMART model also for recovery, because it deals more with sort of like the behaviors and the attitudes that we adopt either in our early recovery or in our active addiction or even before that, and how that drives us to sort of create our own modes of thinking around everything. So
Yeah.
well, great.
I love that term, control fallacies.
Yeah.
That's a really good one, because I'm thinking of the population listening to us, and so many. I didn't get a drunk driving. I didn't hurt anybody else, but I could have, and I was lucky. There wasn't as much enforcement in the 80s. Anyway, all of us, whether it's through manipulating the system and crime or whatever it is, we're seeking control. And we're using strategies that were taught to us in our families that would supposedly give us control and help us have the things we want: security, safety, etc.
Right.
And so much of healing is recognizing those fallacies. So, I've gotten myself in prison. Okay, what survival strategy was I relying on that now when I look at it, it's just a house of cards? If I can be smarter than this guy and get more power than this person, then I can be okay. And so it's whether it's a person who's been in the corporate world or the crime world, or we're all trying to figure out a way to be safe and get what we need. And we've figured it out wrong because we've been seeking all this control and we've been operating from our old scripts. So there is so much potential to change that once we stop numbing ourselves and we start getting help.
Right.
And that help you all are providing. Like, we don't have to live the rest of our lives, you and I, as a perfectionist. We can let ourselves be human. We can say there were mistakes, but right now I have a choice to live a different life and to think differently. It's going to take work. But what's the alternative?
Right.
More misery, more pain, more self-loathing, and disappointment of our loved ones. And I think that's part of why I wrote the second book, because it deals with life's challenges. And one of the biggest challenges is relationships, right?
Yeah.
Where, there's this great book by in the 80s by Ernie Larson called Stage 2 Recovery and Stage 2 Relationships. And he says, you get sober and you deal with those early layers. And then you start realizing, oh man, a lot of these scripts I live with are totally ruining my relationships.
Mm-hmm.
I can't keep a job because I blow up, or I hate my job because I won't speak up for myself, or my loved one, I have to pretend all the time that everything's perfect because I'm afraid I'll lose that loved one. So all these survival strategies that we've been talking about, and he outlines 6 of them in there. A couple of other ones besides perfectionism are people pleasing, caretaking, martyr. No matter what I do, nothing, and there's a couple of others too, but it's kind of naming those and saying, oh my God, that's the lie I've been believing my whole life. That if that's so empowering. And then knowing that isn't true, really. It's a lie I made up to survive. And now I have a choice to create other belief systems, really, that will say it like it is. I'm a human being. I'm not perfect. I've screwed up. And I have all this support to create a new life. Everyone around me, I'm seeing so many people who have created a new life with their recovery programs. I can do it too. I just need to give up the control fallacy and allow myself to be helped by other people.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad you like that term. I hope you get to use it.
Yeah.
And use it a lot. Overuse it. I'm good with that.
Yeah, I will.
So yeah, I get that. I really do. Like deep down inside, I know that I'm in a successful long-term relationship. But when it first started, and if I look back honestly at some of my early relationships in my 20s, I used to hold myself to a very bad standard of what my parents' relationship was like. It ended badly. In the end, they really didn't like one another. And I had adopted a script at that time in my childhood, which was, oh, if I could just make them feel better, everything will be okay. And that certainly didn't serve me well through my young adult life. And then when I got into my own relationship, I thought, well, every other relationship I've ever known is ended badly with 2 people who really didn't like one another. Do I want to do this? And I found out, I was holding myself back for all the wrong reasons. And when I let go of it, when I just said, hey, you know what? My parents were human. They made human mistakes. I'm a human. I'll make mistakes, but let's just see how this plays out. It was like a giant weight had been lifted off of my shoulders where I just didn't have to hold myself to that perfectionism standard anymore, or, that very low bar of failed relationships that I'd witnessed in my past, and just let that stuff go and, live life on its own terms. And it was entirely liberating. I wish I'd remembered those lessons when I was in my early recovery, though, because it might have made my situation a lot easier for me. But, I felt that if I maintained control over myself, everything would get better. And I didn't even realize that at the time, but I was just falling into that old pattern of thinking, which was I need to assert in order to fix everyone else. And then by definition, I'll have fixed myself. And wow, what a stressor that was for me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, I think when we first get sober or are contemplating it, we're in a hurry to get the goodies fast.
Yeah.
I want my want my marriage to be better.
Yeah. Now,
Yeah,
I was
right.
ruminating before this interview if I wanted to say, love, more, and now are all the 3 words that somebody who's new in recovery wants to hear. So you hit that. Whoever your PR person is, they're fantastic. So rock on with that one.
Well, it is true that that the deeper stuff that's been driving us, really, it's fortunate that we don't become aware of the fake ID that we've created. If I'm able to dissolve conflict. I mean, one of my big ones was I'm not lovable. but I didn't know that, but I told myself that. And so I have to create this person. And I was a super people pleaser in my relationship. So I could get high on the initial romantic love, and I could pretend for about 4 years before it would wear off. And I was just that house of cards person. I mean, first of all, I could never tell the person what I needed because I didn't know. I was pretending all the time. So how could I get in there and honor who I was to say how I felt or what I needed? I was just afraid the other person would go running in the other direction. So that early recovery time to realize that I'm sure I'm human with flaws, and I have a beautiful, strong center that I can uncover through whether it's EMDR or 4th steps and 5th steps, but I can uncover all that junk that's hiding the light and blocking that light so that more love can come into me and more love can go out into other, into people.
Yeah.
And so we become less self-centered and less worried about, I got to take care of myself all the time. The best way to take care of ourselves is to do the work of the program and the therapy and the counseling and the sponsor. That's the best way to put the deposits in the sanity bank. Eventually it will yield those wonderful payments, happy relationships.
Without a doubt. And, just to expand on that a little bit too, and give me your feedback, please, but to keep the focus on the self and not on everybody else. That's also vital. From my perspective, it's also vital too, just to make sure that, hey, am I doing this to please somebody else, or am I doing this because it's going to make me feel better in the long run? Because the minute you take the spotlight off of yourself and you put it onto somebody else, that's when things can get really tricky and dangerous. And I don't know that recovery really works that way personally, but I'd like to hear your input on that.
No, you're correct. It's the blame game.
Yeah.
It's their fault. It's not mine. So I don't have any responsibility. So I don't have to do anything. It's the martyr role. And so, yeah, it's a dead end. You're right. And that's why, the honesty of a recovery program, self-honesty, and understanding how much we've been deceiving ourselves and owning our motivations. Mm-hmm. So when I told that person they were 100% wrong, my motivation was to fix them.
Yeah.
And to make myself more comfortable, because they're getting so dogmatic about something I disagreed with made me uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And I have an old soft spot around very inflammatory political talk in my home of origin, with alcohol added as the fire. And it gets me. It's a little soft spot. And I can say, yeah, that's a soft spot. I don't have to react and so on. But I've worked with that. So I know it's okay. It doesn't have to shake me off my square when people get dogmatic.
Now, I find that with myself to be the case when it comes to religion. I love when people have faith in a higher power. It's not something I have, and maybe I'm even a little jealous of it sometimes. It's when people tell me that I have to believe in a certain way. That's when I'm just like, oh no, like you just hit a trauma. There's a trauma response brewing inside of me, and let me tell you why I think you're wrong. And I really, it was important for me to be right at first, and now it's just important for me to let it go. In as much as it does get under my skin, it's not the person I want to be, who's always the argumentative person, especially when, I don't believe that my thoughts should influence other people. Like, here's what works for me. Maybe it'll work for you. It's when, I'm like, do I really need to be right here, or do I just need to, let it go and, accept the person for who they are, even though they can't accept me for who I am? Like, what's going to make me feel better in the long run? And I find it's the latter.
Yes. You mentioned the importance of not trying to control other people. And I have to say that that I know, mostly 12-step people who have really successful long-term recovery with successful relationships and so on, also work Al-Anon. Mm-hmm. Al-Anon family groups, which, isn't just for, are you currently living with an alcoholic? It's for the relationship issues. 12 steps can be applied to the individual and how the individual works with others,
Yeah.
And Al-Anon is just a different frame for that. And the other thing you said that was really helpful is I don't expect myself to never worry or to never close my heart in fear. What I'm striving for is, and give myself kudos for, like you said, is I notice that I've closed my heart or I've gotten defensive or I want to be right. I notice that. I pause. I take some time. Or if I said something nasty to someone, I take a lot of time. I go and talk with my sponsor. I write about it. I inventory it. But I take time before I respond to own my part. What was it about me that made that part so difficult? And now with the dogmatic, they've got to be right, I can pause and then just say, oh, yeah, I get a little triggered by that. It's okay.
Yeah.
I'll just listen, or I'll say, maybe you're right, but I don't have to engage because I have that opportunity to pause and then get the second thought, which is not as defensive.
Right.
Right?
That's right. That's the
Yeah.
that's the not as defensive thought. I love the way that you framed that. Yeah, because again, and sometimes it's a trauma response, and sometimes it's just a learned response. I find that I can weaponize my language, which can is obviously a defense mechanism on my part. And I've become so much better about that. I'm originally a New Yorker, so I was always argumentative about everything, and let me tell you why. And I've sort of gone back on that, but it's a journey, right? Again, self-awareness doesn't come first; it comes later. And the more I progress on my my journey of discovery of myself, the more I begin to learn new things about myself, and I can decide whether or not I want to keep that part of myself or whether it's something I need to let go of. I think this is a great conversation because I feel like the older I get, the more I am beginning to love myself a little bit more, and in doing so, I find I can love others and love the world a little bit more for what it is, as opposed to what it is, the perfection, idealized version of it that I thought it was supposed to be like is just an illusion. So,
Right.
yeah.
And coming to love our true self, the heart,
That's right.
the true self that is essentially good and is in all of us, is such a gift because it's not the personality self that we thought we had to have all together, and that if we presented it to the world, we'd be loved. No, the love is already here. And I wanted to say one thing that's related to this very quickly. You mentioned religion and spirituality, and that's a showstopper for a lot of people. And I'm reading a book now that's called The Soul, The Untethered Soul by Michael Singer. Very popular with a lot of people who are seeking growth. There's not one spiritual or God type term I think he uses the word spiritual a couple of times, but he never talks about a higher power. He says the seat of your soul is this true self, where all the goodness and guidance and love and wisdom, this is what we're wanting to get in touch with. So I didn't let myself read his book until after I wrote mine because I didn't want to be parroting,
Yeah.
But it's a really useful book.
That's great. Yeah, no, I think that goes more to what you write about when you talk about the internalized wisdom. And I love that because it turns the spotlight inward as opposed to pointing it at something else, regardless of what you believe in. Like if you believe that, hey, through praxis, I'm going to gain wisdom, and then how do I internalize that? How do I learn how to love myself? Then everything else just kind of falls into place. And that's what I really loved about it. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
I just finished reading, maybe about a week ago, I finished The Subtle Art of Giving an F. And I'm sorry, The Subtle Art of Not Giving an F. And Yeah, and I was just like, oh, I'm not a big fan of how it's written. Sorry, I'm not. But I really like the message. I jive more with sort of Buddhist philosophy than anything else, and I dug that aspect of it. But it also, again, outside perspective, may not agree with everything, but I take what I can and I leave the rest. And I really like the way that just broadening my horizon in any direction. Ultimately, I do that for myself. Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for all that you've done in helping
Thank
others
you.
to broaden their own awareness.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate all the work you're doing. And, for the people listening, you're really, most of us are between a rock and a hard place, and there's no way but up. It's just allowing people to help us and be willing to let someone else run the show for a while, someone else tell us how to think, because we've proven to ourselves that our way of managing our lives does not work. And of course, at the bottom, when we're just first getting sober, it's very apparent. But even as we go on, I will run into these ways of thinking about the world that are really, now I'm ready to see that is totally driving me nuts. I'm ready to let go of it. So it isn't an all at once thing. And I find that growth and the pulling away of the layers is a very manageable pace. Not always comfortable, but every bit that we pull away and open our hearts is going to bring us more and more happiness. Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah. Again, totally agree with everything that you say. Is there anything that you'd like to, as we start to wrap up, are there any closing thoughts that you have for our audience that you want them to leave with to consider?
The key point is none of us can get better all alone. Just don't try to think about it too much and just follow the directions that are given to you by the mentors that you have in your recovery. And things will get better because you see it all around you. I mean, I'm 37 years sober. I've been happily married to my fourth husband for 31 years.
All right.
I'm very, very happy, very peaceful. I never planned to write these books, but what came from that internal wisdom that said, okay, this is what you're going to do, and I've enjoyed doing it and I have the time doing it. So you will be amazed by what your inner wisdom leads you to do once you get rid of even a few of the layers. You don't have to get rid of everything. You get the payoffs very quickly. So hang in there.
That's right. And folks, you heard it from Gigi Langer, who is a PhD of psychology education. So it's like coming from the highest authority here. So thank you, Gigi, so much for joining us today. All of the respect and all of the love for you. And thank you to our audience. Thank you for joining us on Get in the Herd. Have a wonderful day.